The candles in the great hall had already burned halfway down when Eleanor Hartley heard the whisper that would break her heart. She was standing behind a curtain of white silk, her wedding gown pressed and perfect, when a maid rushed past two guests and said the words that stopped her breath. The Duke was not walking toward the altar to meet her. He was walking toward her sister. Eleanor's hands went cold. For a moment she thought she had misheard. 7 years. 7 years of waiting, of writing letters, of turning away good men who wanted to marry her, of holding on to a promise made under a night sky when she was barely 20 years old. All of it was folding in on itself in the space of a single sentence. She stepped closer to the edge of the curtain, just enough to see through the gap in the fabric. The chapel was full. Every important family in the county had come to witness what everyone believed would be the most celebrated wedding of the year. Rows of candles lined the aisle. Flowers imported from the southern coast filled the air with a sweetness that now felt sickening to her. And there, at the front of the room, stood Duke Alexander Whitmore, tall and composed in his formal coat, looking every bit the man she had waited for. Except he was not looking toward the doorway where Eleanor was meant to enter. He was looking at Charlotte. Charlotte, her own sister, stood near the front pew in a pale blue dress, her chin lifted, her eyes fixed on the Duke with a calm that did not match the chaos Eleanor felt rising inside her chest. It was not the calm of surprise. It was the calm of someone who had expected this moment for a long time. Eleanor pressed a hand against the cold stone wall to steady herself. She thought of all the years behind her, stacked up like pages in a book she had read 100 times, hoping the ending would finally be happy. She had been 17 when she first met Alexander, at a summer gathering hosted by her father's old friend. He had been quiet that day, standing apart from the other young men, watching the dancing rather than joining it. She remembered how he had approached her near the garden wall and asked if she found the music too loud. She had laughed, surprised that a nobleman would care what a merchant's daughter thought about anything. From that single conversation, something had grown between them slowly, the way trust grows between two people who are careful with each other's feelings. He was not like the other young men of his class, who spoke only of themselves and looked at young women as if they were prizes to be collected. Alexander asked questions. He listened. He remembered small details she mentioned only once, like the fact that she loved the smell of rain on dry soil, or that she kept a journal she never showed anyone. When he was called away to serve his family's military obligations across the sea, he had taken her hand in the quiet corner of her father's garden and made her a promise. He told her that when his duty was finished, he would return and marry her, no matter what distance or time stood between them. He gave her a small ring, set with a pale blue stone, telling her it matched the color of the sky on the day they met. She had worn that ring on a chain around her neck every day since, hidden beneath her collar, a secret proof that she was loved and chosen. 7 years. She had turned 27 waiting for him. She had watched her friends marry, have children, build their lives, while she stayed faithful to a man who was somewhere across the ocean, fighting battles she could not imagine. Her parents had grown anxious more than once, gently suggesting that perhaps she should consider other offers, since a duke's promise made in a garden held no legal weight. But Eleanor had refused every time. She trusted him. She trusted the way his voice had sounded when he made that promise, low and certain, without the flattery young men usually use to win a woman's heart. Now, standing behind the curtain in her wedding gown, she understood that trust was not always rewarded with truth. She turned her head slightly and saw her mother, Margaret Hartley, standing near the back of the chapel with a handkerchief pressed to her mouth. Her father, Edmund Hartley, stood beside her mother with his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the front of the room where his younger daughter stood beside the Duke as if she belonged there. Eleanor's mind raced backward, trying to find the moment when everything had shifted without her noticing. She remembered the months after Alexander's return, only weeks ago, when the household had been consumed with wedding preparations. Charlotte had been unusually present during those weeks, offering to help choose flowers, offering to accompany Alexander to meetings with tailors and caterers, claiming she wanted to make herself useful to her sister's happiness. Eleanor had been grateful for the help at the time, too busy and too overwhelmed with joy to notice the way Charlotte's eyes lingered on Alexander a moment too long, or the way she laughed a little too easily at his jokes. She thought now of the evening 2 weeks before the wedding, when she had walked into the drawing room and found Charlotte and Alexander sitting close together, heads bent over a stack of papers related to the seating arrangements. They had both looked up quickly when she entered, and there had been a strange pause before either of them spoke. At the time, Eleanor had dismissed it as nothing, simply two people focused on a shared task. Now that memory returned to her with a different weight, as if she were seeing it for the first time with clear eyes, instead of the trusting eyes of a bride who believed her happiness was already secured. A soft touch on her arm brought her back to the present moment. It was her cousin, Beatrice, who had come to check on her before the ceremony was supposed to begin. "Eleanor," Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling. "I do not understand what is happening. The priest is waiting. The guests are murmuring. Something is wrong." Eleanor swallowed hard, forcing her voice to remain steady, even though her whole body wanted to shake. "I need a moment," she said. "Just a moment, Beatrice, please." Beatrice hesitated, clearly wanting to say something more, but she nodded and stepped back, leaving Eleanor alone with her racing thoughts. Through the gap in the curtain, Eleanor watched as the priest, an older man named Father Collins, who had known her family for years, looked between Alexander and the empty aisle with visible confusion. He glanced toward the side door where Eleanor was supposed to enter, then back to the Duke, waiting for some signal to proceed. The murmuring in the chapel grew louder. Guests turned to whisper to one another, sensing that something unusual was unfolding, but not yet understanding what. Eleanor thought about walking out anyway. Part of her wanted to march down that aisle in her white gown and demand an explanation in front of everyone, to force Alexander to look her in the eyes and tell her exactly what he intended to do. But another part of her, the part that had spent 7 years being patient and careful, felt frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe properly. She thought of the letters he had sent during his years away, dozens of them, filled with promises and small details of his life abroad. He had written about the cold nights on the ship, the friends he had made among the soldiers, the homesickness that sometimes kept him awake. He had written, more than once, that Eleanor's letters were the only thing that made the distance bearable. She had believed every word. Had any of it been true, or had his feelings shifted somewhere along the way, perhaps even before he returned home, and he simply had not found the courage to tell her? A new sound broke through her thoughts, footsteps approaching quickly from the hallway behind her. She turned to see her sister's personal maid, a young woman named Alice, hurrying toward her with an expression caught between fear and urgency. "My lady," Alice said, out of breath, "you must come. There is something you need to know before you go out there." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "What is it?" Alice glanced over her shoulder, as if checking to make sure no one else was listening, then leaned closer. "Miss Charlotte asked me to deliver letters between herself and the Duke over the past 2 months. I did not think much of it at first, since they were working together on wedding matters. But the letters were not about flowers or seating charts, my lady. They were personal, very personal." Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "Personal how?" Alice hesitated, clearly regretting having to be the one to say it. "I did not read them fully, my lady, but I saw enough to understand that Miss Charlotte was not simply helping with the wedding. She was trying to win his attention for herself." The words landed like a physical blow. Eleanor had suspected something was wrong the moment she heard the whisper behind the curtain, but hearing it confirmed by someone who had witnessed it firsthand made the betrayal feel suddenly, sickeningly real. Her own sister, the person she had shared a childhood bedroom with, the person she had comforted during their mother's long illness years ago, the person she had trusted without question, had been quietly working to take away the one thing Eleanor had waited 7 years to have. She thought about confronting Charlotte immediately, storming past the curtain and demanding answers in front of the entire chapel. But something held her back, a strange numbness that made her limbs feel heavy and distant, as if she were watching this entire event happen to someone else, rather than to herself. Beatrice returned a moment later, her face pale. "Eleanor, the Duke has asked Father Collins to proceed. He has asked for Charlotte to stand beside him at the altar." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. It was true then. Not a misunderstanding, not a strange coincidence, but a decision made deliberately and openly, in front of everyone who had gathered to celebrate what they believed was her happiest day. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady the storm inside her chest. When she opened them again, she found a strange clarity settling over her, cold and sharp. She would not hide behind a curtain while her life was rearranged without her voice in the matter. Whatever was about to happen, she would face it standing upright, with her head held high, the way her mother had always taught her to carry herself through difficulty. She stepped toward the small side door that led into the main chapel, her wedding gown trailing behind her like a question no one yet knew how to answer. As her hand touched the cold brass handle, she heard Father Collins's voice rise above the murmuring crowd, asking, with visible discomfort, whether the ceremony should proceed with a different bride standing before him. The chapel fell into a heavy silence, the kind of silence that comes right before something irreversible happens. Eleanor pushed the door open just enough to see the full scene laid out before her. Alexander stood at the altar, his expression unreadable, caught somewhere between guilt and resolve. Charlotte stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, as though she had every right to be there. The guests, dozens of familiar faces from years of family gatherings and social events, stared toward the front of the chapel in stunned disbelief, waiting to see what would happen next. Eleanor stepped fully into the doorway, and every head in the chapel turned toward her at once. For a moment, no one spoke. The candles flickered in the sudden draft from the open door. Alexander's eyes met hers across the length of the aisle, and in that instant, Eleanor searched his face for any sign of regret, any flicker of the man who had promised her a lifetime under a quiet garden sky. What she found instead was something closer to shame, mixed with a determination she did not yet understand. "Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying across the silent chapel, "I did not want you to find out this way." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Eleanor felt every eye in the room shift between her and the altar, waiting to see how the story of her 7 years of waiting would end. Eleanor stood in the doorway with her wedding gown catching the candlelight, and the silence in the chapel stretched so long that she could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Every guest seemed frozen in place, unwilling to be the first to move or speak, as if any sound might shatter the fragile moment even further. She forced herself to walk forward, one slow step at a time, refusing to let her legs shake in front of the people who had come to watch her marry the man she loved. As she reached the middle of the aisle, she noticed her father rising slightly from his seat, his hand gripping the back of the pew in front of him. Her mother remained seated, her handkerchief pressed so tightly to her mouth that her knuckles had turned white. Neither of them moved to intervene, perhaps because they understood, as Eleanor did, that this was a moment she needed to face herself. She stopped a few steps from the altar, close enough now to see the details she had missed from behind the curtain. Charlotte's hand was still resting on Alexander's arm, but her fingers had tightened slightly, as though she sensed the danger of the moment and wanted to hold on to her claim before it could slip away. Alexander's jaw was tense, his eyes darting between Eleanor and the crowd, a man caught between the life he had promised and the choice he seemed to have already made. "Explain it to me," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Not to them." She gestured slightly toward the rows of guests without turning to look at them. "To me. Explain why my sister is standing where I was meant to stand." Alexander opened his mouth, then closed it again, clearly searching for words that would not come easily. Father Collins, standing just behind them with the ceremonial book still open in his hands, looked deeply uncomfortable, glancing between the three of them, as though hoping someone would tell him what to do next. Charlotte was the one who spoke first. "Eleanor, I did not plan for this to happen the way it has. But feelings are not something a person can always control." Her voice held a practiced calm, the same calm Eleanor had noticed earlier through the gap in the curtain. "Feelings," Eleanor repeated, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. "You mean the feelings you built over the past 2 months while helping plan my wedding, while sitting beside my future husband every day, discussing flowers and seating arrangements, and apparently much more than that." A ripple of whispers moved through the chapel at this, guests turning to one another with expressions of shock and disbelief. Eleanor could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her, but she kept her focus on her sister, and the man who was supposed to have been waiting for her, just as faithfully as she had waited for him. "You knew," Eleanor continued, her voice rising slightly, despite her effort to remain composed. "You knew for weeks, and you said nothing. You let me choose flowers, and fittings and vows, while all along you were building something with him behind my back." Charlotte's composure faltered for the first time, a flush rising in her cheeks. "I did try to tell you, Eleanor. More than once. But you were so certain of your happiness, so wrapped up in the idea of your perfect wedding, that I could not find the courage to break it." "That is not the same as caring for me," Eleanor said. "That is protecting yourself from having to face what you were doing. Alexander finally found his voice, stepping slightly forward, as if trying to insert himself into the space between the two sisters. Eleanor, please. This is not about protecting anyone. I owe you an explanation, and I intend to give you one. But not like this. Not in front of everyone who came here today. You do not have the right to decide when I deserve an explanation, Eleanor said, turning her full attention to him now. You made me a promise 7 years ago. I waited through every season, through every letter, through every year. My friends married and built families, while I remained faithful to a man across the ocean. I turned away good men who wanted to give me a life, because I believed in what you and I had built together. And now, on the day you were supposed to keep that promise, I find out that you have spent these past months building something new with my own sister. The chapel had gone completely silent again, every guest hanging on her words. Eleanor could see her father now standing fully, his face a mixture of anger and heartbreak, though he still did not move forward, perhaps sensing that this confrontation belonged to Eleanor alone. Alexander glanced toward Charlotte, then back to Eleanor, and for a moment, something like genuine regret crossed his features. I did love you, he said quietly. I want you to know that what we had was real, at least for me. But when I returned home, something had changed. I cannot explain it fully, even to myself. Perhaps the years apart changed both of us in ways we did not expect. Then you should have told me the moment you felt that change, Eleanor said, her voice trembling now, despite her effort to remain calm. You should have written to me, or spoken to me privately, instead of allowing me to walk down this aisle in front of everyone I know, only to discover the truth through a whisper from a servant. Charlotte flinched slightly at the mention of the servant, and Eleanor realized her sister had not known that Alice had shared the truth about the letters. For a brief moment, the balance of power in the confrontation shifted, and Eleanor felt a flicker of satisfaction beneath the pain, knowing that her sister's careful plan had not accounted for every detail. Father Collins cleared his throat gently, clearly hoping to bring some order to the chaos unfolding in front of him. Perhaps, he said carefully, this conversation would be better continued in a private setting, away from the ceremony. No, Eleanor said firmly, surprising even herself with the strength in her voice. Everyone here came to witness a wedding. I think they deserve to understand exactly what kind of wedding they almost witnessed instead. She turned slowly to face the rows of guests, many of whom she had known her entire life. Family friends, distant relatives, neighbors who had watched her grow up in the same modest house just outside town. She saw sympathy in some faces, shock in others, and in a few, an uncomfortable curiosity that made her stomach twist with humiliation, but she refused to let that humiliation silence her. 7 years ago, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chapel, Alexander Whitmore promised to marry me before he left to serve his family's obligations abroad. I waited faithfully, through every one of those years, believing in a promise made under a night sky in my father's garden. I believed in him because I trusted him, and because he gave me every reason to believe his feelings were true and lasting. She paused, glancing briefly at Charlotte, who stood frozen beside Alexander, her earlier composure completely gone now, replaced by something closer to panic. I did not know, Eleanor continued, that while I was preparing for what I believed would be the happiest day of my life, my own sister was quietly working to take that happiness for herself. I do not know how long this has been happening, or how deeply it runs, but I do know that I will not stand here and pretend this is simply a misunderstanding, or a matter of feelings that could not be helped. Her mother finally rose from her seat, moving slowly toward the front of the chapel, her face streaked with tears. Eleanor, please, she said softly. Let us discuss this privately, away from all these eyes. Mother, Eleanor said gently but firmly, I have spent 7 years being patient, being quiet, being the good and faithful daughter who waited without complaint. I think I have earned the right to speak plainly, even if it is uncomfortable for everyone watching. Her father finally moved forward as well, standing beside his wife, his expression a mixture of pride and sorrow, as he looked at his eldest daughter standing tall in front of the gathered crowd. Your mother is right that this is difficult for everyone to witness, he said, but I will not ask you to soften your words, simply to spare others discomfort. You have every right to say what needs to be said. Eleanor felt a small measure of strength return to her at her father's words, a reminder that not everyone in her family had betrayed her trust. She turned back to Alexander, who stood watching her with an expression she could not quite name, somewhere between guilt and something that looked almost like admiration for the composure she was managing to hold on to despite everything. "I will not beg you to keep your promise," she said to him quietly, though her voice still carried through the silent chapel. "A promise kept out of guilt or obligation is not worth having. If your feelings have truly changed, then perhaps it is better that I learned the truth now, rather than after we were bound together for a lifetime." Alexander opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Charlotte stepped forward slightly, her voice shaking but determined. "Eleanor, I know you believe I have done something unforgivable, and perhaps I have, but I did not set out to hurt you. I simply could not stop what grew between us once it began." "You had every opportunity to stop it," Eleanor said, turning to face her sister directly, for the first time since entering the chapel. "You had every opportunity to come to me and tell me the truth, rather than allowing it to unfold in secret until this exact moment. Whatever grew between you and Alexander, you chose to let it grow in silence, knowing full well what it would cost me if it was ever discovered." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears, but Eleanor found she could not summon the sympathy her sister seemed to be hoping for. Not yet. Perhaps not for a long time. The chapel remained silent, waiting to see what would happen next, as the three central figures in this unraveling story stood frozen at the altar, each caught in a different kind of heartbreak, none of them certain how the moment would resolve itself. Eleanor did not wait for anyone to tell her what to do next. She turned from the altar, gathered the edges of her gown in both hands, and walked back down the aisle the same way she had entered. Except this time, her steps were steady and sure, carrying her away from the chapel rather than toward it. Behind her, she heard murmurs rising again among the guests, and somewhere in the confusion, she thought she heard her mother calling her name, but she did not turn back. She pushed through the heavy chapel doors and stepped into the cold air outside, grateful for the sharp bite of wind against her face after the suffocating heat of the crowded room. The carriages meant to carry the newly married couple away sat waiting in the courtyard, decorated with ribbons and flowers that now seemed like a cruel joke. Eleanor walked past them without stopping, moving toward the garden path that wound behind the chapel, a place she had walked 100 times as a child. She did not know where she was going, until her feet carried her to the old stone bench beneath the oak tree, the same tree where she used to sit with Charlotte when they were girls, sharing secrets and dreams about the lives they would someday build. The irony of it struck her hard enough to make her stomach ache. She sat down slowly, the fabric of her gown pooling around her like spilled milk, and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything that had just happened. Tears came quickly, silent at first, then shaking her shoulders as the reality settled deeper into her chest. 7 years of faithfulness, of turning away kind and honest men who had offered her real futures, all because she believed in a promise made by a man who apparently could not keep it when it mattered most. She thought of the letters she had saved in a small wooden box beneath her bed, each one read and reread until the paper had softened at the edges. She thought of the ring hanging around her neck, hidden beneath her collar even now, a symbol of a love that had apparently meant something different to him than it had to her. Footsteps approached from behind, careful and hesitant, and Eleanor did not need to turn around to know who it was. "Please go away, Charlotte," she said, her voice thick with tears she refused to fully release in front of her sister. "I could not let you sit out here alone," Charlotte said softly, though she stopped a respectful distance away, not daring to sit beside her sister uninvited. "You should have thought about what you were doing to me months ago," Eleanor said, finally turning to look at her sister's face, tear-streaked and pale. "Not now, after everything has already happened." Charlotte lowered herself carefully onto the far end of the stone bench, leaving a wide space between them. "I have hated myself every day since this began," she said quietly. "I told myself 100 times that I would stop, that I would tell you the truth, that I would step back and let you have the life you had waited so long to build. But every time I tried, I could not make myself do it." "Why not?" Eleanor asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "What was so difficult about telling your own sister the truth?" Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the garden path, where autumn leaves had begun to gather in small piles along the edges. "Because I knew what it would cost you," she finally said, "and because I was afraid of what it would cost me as well. If I told you and stepped back, I would spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. If I said nothing and let things continue, I risked losing you entirely, which is exactly what has happened now. You could have chosen differently, Eleanor said. You could have refused to let anything grow between you and a man who was promised to your own sister. That choice was always yours to make, Charlotte, and you made the wrong one every single day for months. Charlotte's tears fell freely now, but Eleanor found she still could not summon the forgiveness her sister seemed to be silently pleading for. Some wounds, she realized, needed more than immediate tears to heal. What will you do now? Charlotte asked, after a long silence, her voice small and uncertain. Eleanor looked up at the bare branches of the oak tree above them, remembering summers spent climbing its lower limbs with Charlotte close behind her, laughing, and daring each other to climb higher. That closeness felt like a different lifetime now, separated from this moment by a gap too wide to measure. I do not know, she said honestly. I have spent 7 years planning my life around a promise that no longer exists. I have no plan for what comes after this. Alexander still wishes to speak with you, Charlotte said hesitantly. He asked me to tell you that, before I followed you out here. I do not care what Alexander wishes right now, Eleanor said, standing from the bench and smoothing the front of her gown, with hands that still trembled slightly. He had 7 years to decide what he truly wanted, and he chose to make that decision in the cruelest way possible, in front of everyone we know, rather than being honest with me in private, the moment his feelings began to change. She began walking back toward the chapel, though not with any intention of returning inside. Instead, she moved toward the side path that led to the small cottage where her family had been staying during the wedding preparations, wanting only to remove the gown that now felt like a costume from a play that had gone terribly wrong. Charlotte followed a few steps behind, clearly unwilling to let the conversation end there. Eleanor, please. I know I have hurt you in a way that may never be repaired, but you are still my sister. I do not want to lose you over this, even if I understand why you might want nothing more to do with me. You should have thought about losing me before you let this happen, Charlotte, not after. She continued walking, leaving her sister standing alone on the garden path, and did not look back again. By the time she reached the small cottage, word of what had happened in the chapel had clearly already spread among the household staff. The housekeeper, an older woman named Mrs. Pratt who had served the Hartley family for over 20 years, met her at the door with an expression of deep sympathy, saying nothing but immediately moving to help Eleanor out of her wedding gown with gentle, practiced hands. As the layers of silk and lace fell away, Eleanor felt something in her chest loosen slightly, as though removing the physical costume of the day helped her begin separating herself from the identity she had worn for 7 years, the faithful woman waiting for her duke. She did not yet know who she would become without that identity, but standing in her simple undergarments in the quiet cottage bedroom, she felt the first small stirring of something that was not quite relief, but was perhaps its distant cousin. Mrs. Pratt helped her into a simple day dress and brushed out her hair, which had been elaborately styled for the wedding, without asking a single question about what had happened. Eleanor was grateful for the silence, grateful to have at least one person in that moment who did not require her to explain or defend herself. "Your mother is asking for you," Mrs. Pratt said gently once she had finished. "She is quite beside herself with worry." Eleanor nodded, though she did not move immediately toward the door. "Give me a few more minutes," she said. "I need to gather myself before I face her questions." Mrs. Pratt nodded and left the room quietly, closing the door behind her. Eleanor sat down at the small dressing table, staring at her own reflection in the mirror, searching her face for some sign of the change she felt happening inside her. She looked the same as she had that morning, before any of this began. The same brown eyes, the same dark hair, the same features she had always known. But something behind her eyes felt different now, harder somehow, as though the events of the day had carved away a layer of the trusting, patient woman she had been for so long. She reached up and unclasped the chain around her neck, pulling the small ring with its pale blue stone from beneath her collar. She held it in her palm for a long moment, remembering the garden, the promise, the 7 years of faith she had placed in a man who had ultimately chosen someone else. Then, slowly, she set the ring down on the dressing table, no longer wanting it hidden against her skin, no longer wanting to carry its weight as a secret proof of a love that had turned out to be temporary. A knock came at the door, softer than Mrs. Pratt's had been. "Eleanor," her mother's voice called through the wood, trembling slightly. "May I come in?" Eleanor took a deep breath, glancing once more at her reflection, before rising to open the door. Whatever came next, she would face it standing upright, just as she had promised herself in the chapel doorway. The wedding was over, the promise broken, but her life, she realized with a strange and unexpected clarity, was only just beginning to find its true shape. Margaret Hartley stepped into the small bedroom, with her eyes still red from crying, though she had clearly tried to compose herself before knocking. She crossed the room and pulled Eleanor into a tight embrace, holding her the way she had when Eleanor was a child recovering from a fever, as though physical closeness could somehow undo the damage of the day. "I am so sorry," her mother whispered against her hair. "I should have seen it. I should have noticed something was wrong before it came to this." Eleanor pulled back gently, studying her mother's face. "Did you know, Mother? Did you suspect anything before today?" Margaret shook her head firmly. "No, Eleanor, I promise you I did not know. If I had suspected even a small part of what was happening, I would have confronted your sister myself, long before it reached this point. I am as shocked as you are, perhaps more so, because I never imagined Charlotte capable of something like this." Eleanor believed her mother, though the reassurance did little to ease the ache in her chest. She sat down on the edge of the narrow bed, smoothing the fabric of her simple day dress with restless fingers. "What is happening now, back at the chapel? Has everyone left?" "Your father is speaking with Alexander's family," Margaret said carefully. "There are questions about the arrangements, about how this will be explained to everyone who was invited, about what will happen with the wedding contracts that were already signed." "Contracts?" Eleanor repeated bitterly, as though this were only a matter of paperwork and not a matter of my entire life. Margaret sat beside her daughter and took her hand gently. "I know it feels that way right now, but there are practical matters that must be addressed, even in the middle of heartbreak. Your father is trying to protect our family's reputation as much as he can, though I fear the damage may already be done. Word of what happened will spread through the county faster than any of us can control." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, imagining the whispers that would follow her now, the pitying looks from neighbors, the quiet gossip at social gatherings for months or even years to come. She had spent 7 years being known as the faithful woman, waiting for her Duke. Now she would be known as the woman whose own sister had taken him from her at the altar. Neither identity felt like one she had chosen for herself. "I do not want to stay here," Eleanor said suddenly, surprising even herself with the certainty in her voice. "I cannot remain in this town, watching Charlotte build a life with him, while everyone whispers about what happened to me." Margaret's expression softened with understanding, though concern remained in her eyes. "Where would you go, Eleanor? You have spent your whole life here." "Aunt Louisa," Eleanor said, the idea forming clearly in her mind, even as she spoke it aloud. "She has asked me more than once to visit her in the city, to help with her work at the charitable hospital she oversees. I always refused, because I did not want to be away when Alexander returned. But now there is no reason to stay." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the practical difficulties of such a plan against her daughter's obvious need to escape the immediate aftermath of her humiliation. "Your father may resist the idea at first," she said finally. "But I think, given everything that has happened, he will understand your need for distance. I will speak with him tonight." Eleanor felt a small measure of gratitude toward her mother, the first genuine relief she had felt since the moment Alice had delivered the terrible truth about Charlotte's letters. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I do not think I can face the coming weeks here, watching this town decide what to think of me." A commotion sounded from somewhere near the front of the cottage, voices raised in argument, and both women turned toward the door with matching expressions of concern. Moments later, Edmund Hartley's voice carried clearly through the thin walls, sharp with an anger Eleanor had rarely heard from her normally composed father. "You will not speak to my daughter that way in my own household," he was saying to someone, though Eleanor could not immediately place the second voice responding to him. She rose from the bed and moved toward the door, her mother following close behind, both women stepping into the small hallway just as Alexander appeared at the entrance to the cottage, his formal wedding coat now discarded somewhere, replaced by a simple dark jacket that made him look older and more tired than Eleanor remembered him looking even earlier that day. "I only wish to speak with Eleanor," Alexander said, his voice carrying a note of desperation that had not been present in the chapel. "Please, just a few minutes of her time." Edmund stood between Alexander and the hallway leading to his daughter's room. his arms crossed firmly over his chest. "You have caused enough damage for one day, young man. I do not think my daughter owes you any further conversation." "It is all right, father," Eleanor said quietly, stepping forward despite her mother's hand reaching out to stop her. "I will speak with him. I have questions of my own that deserve answers, even if I do not owe him anything." Edmund studied his daughter's face for a long moment, searching for any sign that she was not truly ready for this conversation. Whatever he found there must have reassured him somewhat, because he stepped aside, though his expression remained guarded and protective. Eleanor led Alexander to the small sitting room at the front of the cottage, a modest space with worn furniture that had served her family for years. She did not offer him a seat, and she remained standing herself, arms crossed over her chest, in an unconscious mirror of her father's earlier posture. "You wish to speak with me," she said, "so speak." Alexander ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Eleanor remembered from years ago, one he made whenever he was struggling to find the right words. "I do not know how to explain what happened without sounding like I am making excuses," he began. "But I want you to understand that I never intended to hurt you, Eleanor. When I returned home after all those years away, I expected to feel exactly as I had before I left. I expected our reunion to feel like coming home in every sense. But something had shifted, and I could not understand it at first. And Charlotte was there to help you understand it," Eleanor said flatly. Alexander winced slightly at the accusation in her tone. "She was there," he admitted, "and somehow, being near her felt different than being near you. I do not know how to explain it beyond that. I fought against it for weeks, telling myself it was simply the strangeness of returning after so long away, that my feelings for you would settle back into place, given enough time. But the closer we came to the wedding, the more certain I became that something had genuinely changed within me. And instead of telling me," Eleanor said, "you decided the best course of action was to let me walk down that aisle, in front of everyone we know, only to discover the truth, in the most public and humiliating way possible." "I know," Alexander said, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine regret. "I have asked myself 100 times over these past weeks why I could not simply come to you privately and tell you the truth. I think, in some cowardly part of myself, I hoped that seeing you again in that gown, hearing the vows, feeling the weight of the promise I made all those years ago, might be enough to make my feelings return to where they belonged. I was wrong to gamble with your heart that way, and I am sorry for it, more than I can properly express." Eleanor studied his face, searching for the man she had loved for 7 years, the man whose letters had kept her faithful through countless lonely seasons. She found traces of him still there, in the familiar lines of his face, the particular way his brow furrowed with worry. But something essential had shifted between them, and she understood now that it could not be repaired simply through an apology, however sincere it seemed. "I appreciate your honesty," she said finally, "even though it comes far too late to spare me any real pain. But I do not think there is anything more to say between us now. Whatever you feel for Charlotte, whatever she feels for you, that is a path you have both chosen, and I will not stand in its way any longer. But do not expect me to forgive easily, and do not expect me to remain in this town, watching the two of you build the life that was supposed to be mine." "Where will you go?" Alexander asked, a note of genuine concern in his voice that Eleanor found she no longer had the energy to appreciate or resent. "That is no longer your concern," she said quietly, moving toward the door of the sitting room to indicate that the conversation had reached its end. "Please leave now. I think we have both said everything that needs to be said." Alexander hesitated a moment longer, as though hoping for some final word of forgiveness or understanding. But when none came, he nodded slowly and moved toward the door, pausing once more before stepping outside. "I did love you, Eleanor. I hope, in time, you will believe that." Eleanor said nothing in response, watching him go until the door closed behind him, leaving her alone, in the small sitting room, with the wreckage of 7 years settling quietly around her like dust after a storm. She did not cry again, not immediately. Instead, she felt something steadier taking root inside her, a quiet resolve that had nothing to do with the man who had just left, and everything to do with the life she now needed to build for herself. 3 weeks after the wedding that never was, Eleanor stepped off a carriage in the city of Ashford, the bustling town where her Aunt Louisa had lived for the past decade, running a charitable hospital that served families who could not otherwise afford proper medical care. The journey had taken 2 full days, and Eleanor had spent much of it staring out the carriage window, watching the countryside give way slowly to busier roads, larger towns, and finally the crowded streets of the city itself. Louisa Hartley, her father's younger sister, met her at the carriage stop with an expression of warm sympathy that did not linger on pity for too long, something Eleanor found herself deeply grateful for. Louisa had always been considered somewhat unconventional within the family, choosing to remain unmarried and dedicate her life to running the hospital rather than settling into the expected role of wife and mother. As a girl, Eleanor had found her aunt fascinating, if a little intimidating, and now, arriving in the aftermath of her own broken engagement, she found herself grateful for a relative who had built a life entirely outside the expectations that had so recently failed her. "You look tired," Louisa said bluntly, embracing her niece briefly, before gesturing toward a modest carriage waiting nearby. "Come, let us get you settled before we discuss anything difficult." The house Louisa kept was smaller than the Hartley family home, but comfortable, filled with books stacked in every available corner, and papers related to hospital business scattered across nearly every surface. Eleanor's room was simple but pleasant, with a window that looked out over a small garden and, beyond it, the rooftops of the city stretching toward the horizon. "You are welcome to stay as long as you need," Louisa said, standing in the doorway as Eleanor set down her single travel case. "I will not pretend to know exactly what you are feeling, since I never experienced anything quite like what happened to you. But I do know something about building a life that looks different from what everyone expects. I do not know what I want my life to look like now," Eleanor admitted quietly. "For 7 years, I had a clear picture of my future. Now that picture is gone, and I have nothing to replace it with." Louisa considered this for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Perhaps that is not entirely a bad thing," she said. "A clear picture can sometimes become a cage, even when it looks like a comfortable one. You have an opportunity now that many people never receive, the chance to build something entirely your own, without the shape of someone else's promise, guiding every decision you make." Eleanor was not certain she believed her aunt's words yet, but something in them settled quietly into her chest, a small seed of possibility she had not expected to find so soon after her heartbreak. Over the following days, she found herself drawn increasingly toward the hospital, where Louisa spent most of her waking hours, initially simply to escape the quiet loneliness of the house, but gradually, because the work itself began to interest her in ways she had not anticipated. The hospital served families from the poorer districts of the city, treating everything from common illnesses to more serious injuries sustained in the factories that had grown rapidly along the river in recent years. Eleanor began by simply observing, sitting quietly in the corner of the main ward, while Louisa and the small staff of nurses moved between patients. But within a week, she found herself being asked to help with small tasks, carrying supplies, sitting with frightened children while their parents spoke with the doctors, writing letters for patients who could not write themselves. She discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was good at calming frightened people. Perhaps it was the years of patience she had cultivated while waiting for Alexander, patience that had served no purpose in the end for her own heart, but which now found a new and meaningful outlet in comforting strangers during their most difficult moments. A young mother whose child had suffered a serious fever found herself calmed by Eleanor's steady presence at her side through a long night of worry. An elderly man recovering from an injury sustained at the docks found himself laughing, for the first time in days, at Eleanor's gentle jokes as she helped him with his meals. Word of the broken wedding had, as her mother predicted, spread through her home county quickly, but here in Ashford, among strangers who knew nothing of Duke Alexander Whitmore or the sister who had taken her place at the altar, Eleanor found a strange and welcome anonymity. For the first time in years, people looked at her without any preconceived story attached to her name. She was simply Eleanor, the niece helping at her aunt's hospital, and that simplicity felt like a gift after months of being defined entirely by her relationship to a man who had ultimately chosen someone else. Letters arrived from her mother regularly, filled with updates about the situation back home. Charlotte and Alexander had married quietly, without the grand celebration originally planned, in a small ceremony attended only by immediate family. The wider social circle, Margaret wrote, remained divided in their opinions, some sympathizing deeply with Eleanor's heartbreak, others whispering that perhaps she had simply waited too long. expected too much from a promise made when both parties were young and uncertain of their futures. Eleanor read these letters with a strange detachment, as though the events described belonged to a story about someone else's life, rather than her own. One evening, several weeks into her stay in Ashford, Louisa found Eleanor sitting alone in the hospital's small garden after the day's work had ended, staring up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "You seem different than when you first arrived," Louisa observed, settling onto the bench beside her niece. "I feel different," Eleanor admitted, "though I could not quite explain how, if you ask me directly." "Perhaps you do not need to explain it," Louisa said. "Perhaps it is simply enough to notice that something has shifted, without demanding to understand every detail of how or why." Eleanor considered this quietly, watching the last light fade from the sky above the city rooftops. "I keep thinking about the ring he gave me," she said after a moment. "I left it on the dressing table in the cottage before I came here. I do not know if my mother has kept it safe or thrown it away, and strangely, I find I do not care which." "That sounds like progress to me," Louisa said gently. "Perhaps," Eleanor agreed. "Though I still do not know what comes next for me. I cannot stay in your house forever, relying on your kindness, while I figure out my own path." "You are welcome to stay as long as you need," Louisa repeated. "But if it would help, there is a position at the hospital that has recently become available. One of our senior nurses is retiring at the end of the season, and I believe you have shown yourself to have a genuine talent for this kind of work. It would require training, of course, but I think you would do well, if it is something that interests you." Eleanor turned to look at her aunt in surprise. She had not considered, until this exact moment, that the work she had drifted into, almost by accident, might become something more permanent, something she could build an entire life around, rather than simply a temporary distraction from her heartbreak. "I would need to think about it," Eleanor said slowly, though even as she spoke the words, she felt a small flicker of excitement beginning to grow beneath her uncertainty. "But thank you, Aunt Louisa. Thank you for everything. Truly, I do not know how I would have managed these past weeks without your kindness." "You are stronger than you realize, Eleanor," Louisa said, patting her niece's hand gently. "I suspect you always were, even during those 7 years of waiting. Sometimes it simply takes the right circumstances to reveal the strength that was there all along." They sat together in comfortable silence as the stars grew brighter overhead, and for the first time since the terrible day of the wedding, Eleanor felt something that resembled genuine hope beginning to take root within her, quiet and small, but undeniably present. Back in the county Eleanor had left behind, the small quiet ceremony that finally united Charlotte and Alexander did little to settle the whispers that continued moving through the drawing rooms and market squares of their community. Charlotte had imagined, in the weeks leading up to her marriage, that once she and Alexander were finally bound together as husband and wife, the difficult period of scandal and judgment would begin to fade, replaced by the comfortable acceptance that typically followed any respectable marriage. Instead, she found herself living within a silence far heavier than the whispers themselves, a silence that existed primarily between herself and the man she had fought so hard to win. Alexander had grown quiet in the weeks following the wedding, spending long hours away from their new home, attending to matters related to his family's estate that seemed to require far more of his time than Charlotte had anticipated. When he was present, he was polite, even kind in his own reserved way, but something essential seemed to be missing from his manner, a warmth that Charlotte remembered from the months when they had worked together planning what was supposed to have been Eleanor's wedding. She told herself, during the early days of their marriage, that this distance was simply the natural adjustment period that any new couple experienced, especially one that had begun under such difficult circumstances. But as weeks turned into a full month, and the distance showed no signs of closing, Charlotte began to feel a creeping dread that perhaps she had won something that was not truly hers to keep in the way she had imagined. One evening, as they sat together in the drawing room of their new home, Charlotte finally worked up the courage to address the growing silence directly. "You seem troubled," she said carefully, setting aside the needlework she had been only pretending to focus on. "Is something wrong?" Alexander looked up from the papers he had been reviewing, his expression distant. "I am simply tired," he said. "There is a great deal to manage, with the estate matters my father left unresolved before his passing last year." "That is not the only thing troubling you," Charlotte said gently. "I can see it in the way you look at me sometimes. as though you are searching for something you cannot quite find. Alexander set down his papers slowly, studying his wife's face for a long moment before answering. "I do not wish to hurt you further than I already have," he said carefully. "But since you have asked directly, I will try to answer honestly. I find myself thinking of Eleanor more often than I expected to, especially in quiet moments like this one. Not in a way that suggests regret about our marriage, but simply as a presence that seems to linger at the edges of my thoughts." Charlotte felt her chest tighten at this admission, though she had suspected as much for weeks without daring to voice the fear aloud. "Do you regret choosing me?" she asked quietly, her voice smaller than she intended. Alexander was quiet for a long moment before shaking his head slowly. "I do not think regret is quite the right word," he said, "but I wonder sometimes whether what grew between us was built on solid ground, or whether it was simply the excitement of something new and forbidden, which now feels different once it has become ordinary and permanent." The words landed hard, though Charlotte forced herself to remain composed rather than allowing the hurt to show fully on her face. She had spent months convincing herself that her feelings for Alexander were genuine, deeper than simple ambition or jealousy toward her sister's good fortune. But hearing him question the very foundation of what they had built together made her wonder, for the first time, whether she had deceived herself as much as she had deceived Eleanor. "I have given up a great deal for what we have," she said carefully. "My relationship with my own sister, likely for the rest of my life. The respect of many people in our community who now view me as someone willing to betray family for personal gain. I would like to believe that what I gave up those things for was worth the cost." "I did not ask you to give up anything," Alexander said, though his voice carried more weariness than accusation. "I take responsibility for my own choices in this matter, Charlotte, but I cannot pretend that everything feels as certain now as it did in those weeks before the wedding, when everything still felt like a secret we were building together, rather than a life we now must actually live." Charlotte rose from her seat, moving toward the window that looked out over the estate grounds, needing distance to process the conversation properly. "What do you suggest we do then?" she asked, her back still turned toward him. "We are married now, Alexander. There is no undoing what has already been done, regardless of whatever doubts either of us might be feeling." "I am not suggesting we undo anything," Alexander said, rising to stand behind her, though he did not reach out to touch her. "I am simply being honest with you, as I should have been honest with Eleanor before the wedding rather than after. I think we owe each other that honesty now, even if it is difficult to hear." Charlotte turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears she refused to let fall. "Then let me be equally honest," she said. "I have wondered, in these quiet weeks, whether I truly loved you, or whether I simply could not bear watching my sister receive the happiness and attention that I felt I deserved just as much. I have spent my entire life standing in Eleanor's shadow, watching her be praised for her patience and her loyalty, while I was overlooked simply for being the younger daughter without a grand romantic story attached to my name." Alexander studied her carefully, surprised by the depth of honesty in her confession. "And now?" he asked quietly. "Now I do not know," Charlotte admitted. "I know that I care for you, Alexander, genuinely. But I also know that some part of what drove me toward you was never truly about you at all. It was about proving something to myself, about no longer being the sister who was overlooked." The admission hung heavy in the air between them, and for a long moment, neither spoke, both absorbing the weight of what had finally been said aloud after weeks of careful avoidance. "We are still married," Alexander said finally, his voice gentle despite the difficulty of the conversation. "Whatever brought us to this point, whatever mixture of genuine feeling and complicated motivation existed between us, we owe it to ourselves and to each other to try building something honest from here forward, rather than continuing to avoid these difficult truths." Charlotte nodded slowly, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I would like that," she said. "I do not wish to spend the rest of my life haunted by the ghost of what happened at the altar, wondering constantly whether you wish you had chosen differently." "Then let us try," Alexander said, finally reaching out to take her hand gently. "Not because it is easy, but because we have both made our choices, and running from the consequences of those choices will only make us both more miserable than facing them honestly." Meanwhile, at the family estate, Edmund and Margaret Hartley found themselves navigating their own difficult adjustment to the fractured state of their family. Edmund had grown noticeably colder toward Charlotte since the wedding, unable to fully forgive the pain she had caused her sister, even as he tried to maintain some semblance of a relationship with his younger daughter for the sake of family unity. Margaret, torn between her love for both her daughters, found herself writing long letters to Eleanor in Ashford, trying to bridge the growing distance within their family, while respecting Eleanor's clear need for space from everyone connected to the events of that terrible day. The community continued its slow process of forming opinions about what had happened, some families choosing to align themselves firmly with Eleanor's side of the story, extending sympathy and support through letters and visits to the Hartley household, while others found themselves drawn to the more dramatic narrative of Charlotte and Alexander's supposedly passionate love story, romanticizing the scandal in ways that made both Charlotte and Alexander deeply uncomfortable whenever they encountered such reactions in social settings. Through it all, the fractured Hartley family continued the difficult work of determining what their relationships would look like going forward, each member carrying their own private burden of guilt, heartbreak, or uncertainty about a future that none of them had anticipated when the wedding invitations were first sent out so many months before. 6 months after arriving in Ashford, Eleanor had accepted the position at the hospital that Louisa had offered her, and had begun the demanding but rewarding process of formal training as a nurse, under the supervision of the hospital's small medical staff. The work was often exhausting, filled with long hours and difficult cases, but Eleanor found in it a sense of purpose that had been entirely absent during her years of quiet waiting back home. Each day brought new challenges, new patients requiring her attention and care, and gradually, the sharp edges of her heartbreak began to soften into something more manageable, a memory she carried, rather than a wound that constantly bled. It was during this period that she first encountered Dr. Nathaniel Cole, a young physician who had recently joined the hospital staff after completing his training in the capital. He was, in many ways, unlike Alexander, in every respect that mattered. Where Alexander had carried himself with the practiced confidence of a nobleman certain of his place in the world, Nathaniel moved through the hospital wards with a quiet earnestness, genuinely absorbed in the well-being of his patients, rather than concerned with how his actions might be perceived by others. Their first real conversation occurred late one evening, when Eleanor remained after her official shift had ended, sitting with a young boy whose leg had been badly injured in an accident at one of the nearby factories. The boy's parents had been forced to return home to care for younger children, leaving Eleanor to sit with him through the difficult hours, as the medication took effect and the pain gradually subsided enough for him to sleep. Nathaniel found her there, quietly humming a soft tune to help calm the frightened child, and rather than simply passing through on his rounds, he paused, leaning against the doorframe to observe for a moment before speaking. "You have a gift for this," he said quietly, once the boy had finally drifted into a peaceful sleep. "Many nurses know the technical requirements of the work, but few manage to bring the kind of calm you seem to offer so naturally." Eleanor looked up, slightly startled by his presence, though she offered a tired smile in response. "I have had a great deal of practice being patient with difficult circumstances," she said, the words carrying more weight than the young doctor could have understood from their simple conversation. Over the following weeks, their paths crossed regularly within the busy rhythms of hospital life, brief conversations exchanged between tending to patients, shared moments of quiet relief when a difficult case resolved favorably, occasional meals taken together in the small staff room when their schedules happened to align. Eleanor found herself genuinely enjoying Nathaniel's company, appreciating his dry humor and the genuine curiosity he brought to every conversation, whether discussing medical matters or simply exchanging thoughts about books they had both read. Unlike her cautious approach to most personal matters since arriving in Ashford, Eleanor found herself gradually lowering her guard around Nathaniel, sharing small details about her life before the city, though she remained careful to avoid the full story of what had brought her here. It was Louisa, eventually, who gently encouraged her to be more open. "He is a good man," Louisa said one evening, as the two women shared a quiet dinner at home. "I have watched him work alongside many of our staff over these past months, and I have never once seen him behave with anything less than complete integrity and kindness." "I am not ready to trust my judgment about good men just yet," Eleanor admitted, though she said it with a small smile, rather than the bitterness such a statement might have carried months earlier. "Perhaps trust is not something you need to rush," Louisa said, "but I do not think it would hurt to allow yourself to enjoy his company without demanding immediate certainty about where it might lead." Eleanor considered this advice carefully over the following weeks, gradually allowing herself small moments of genuine happiness in Nathaniel's presence, without the anxious need to categorize or predict what such happiness might eventually mean for her future. It was a different kind of patience than the patience she had practiced during her 7 years of waiting for Alexander. This new patience, rooted not in blind faith toward a distant promise, but in simply allowing something good to develop naturally, without forcing it toward any particular conclusion. One afternoon, as autumn settled fully over the city and the hospital garden filled with fallen leaves, Nathaniel found Eleanor sitting alone on the same bench where she had once spoken with Louisa about her uncertain future. He approached carefully, clearly sensing that something weighed on her mind. "You seem thoughtful today," he observed, settling onto the bench a respectful distance away from her. Eleanor was quiet for a moment before answering. "My mother wrote to me this morning," she said finally. "My sister is expecting her first child. It seems strange to think of becoming an aunt to a child born from the marriage that was supposed to have been mine." Nathaniel listened carefully, not offering easy reassurances or dismissing the complexity of her feelings. "How does that news sit with you?" he asked gently. Eleanor considered the question honestly before responding. "Strange," she admitted. "Not painful in the way it might have been a year ago, but strange nonetheless. I think perhaps I have finally reached a place where I can acknowledge that their life continues moving forward, just as mine has, without either path needing to diminish the other." "That sounds like genuine healing to me," Nathaniel said quietly. "Perhaps," Eleanor agreed, "though I still carry pieces of what happened with me, even here, even now, even as I have built something new for myself in this city." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, considering his next words carefully. "I do not think healing requires forgetting entirely," he said finally. "I think it simply means carrying the difficult parts of our history in a way that no longer controls every decision we make going forward. You have clearly done a great deal of that difficult work already, Eleanor, whether or not you fully recognize it yourself." Eleanor turned to look at him properly, struck by the genuine understanding in his words, understanding that came not from someone trying to win her affection through flattery, but from someone who had clearly observed her journey with real attentiveness and care. "Thank you for saying that," she said softly. "I do not think I realized how much I needed to hear it until this exact moment." They sat together in comfortable silence as the autumn afternoon light slanted golden through the garden trees, and for the first time since arriving in Ashford, Eleanor allowed herself to consider, cautiously and without demanding immediate certainty, that perhaps her story was not simply one of heartbreak and recovery, but might yet include new chapters of genuine happiness she had not previously imagined possible. Word soon reached her, however, that would test this fragile new peace in ways she could not have anticipated. A letter arrived from her father, its tone more urgent than his usual careful correspondence, informing her that Charlotte had fallen seriously ill during the difficult final months of her pregnancy, and that the family physician had expressed genuine concern about both her sister's health and that of the unborn child. Her father asked, gently but clearly, whether Eleanor might consider returning home, at least temporarily, given her new training and skills that could prove valuable during this difficult time. Eleanor read the letter twice, sitting alone in her small room in Louisa's house, feeling old wounds stir alongside genuine concern for her sister's well-being. Despite everything that had happened between them, despite the betrayal that had reshaped the entire course of her life, she found she could not simply dismiss the possibility that Charlotte might be in real danger, nor could she ignore the pull of family loyalty that still existed beneath the layers of hurt and distance. She sat with the letter long into the evening, weighing the difficult question of whether returning home would undo the careful healing she had built for herself in Ashford, or whether it might instead represent an opportunity to finally close the difficult chapter that had defined so much of her recent life. Eleanor made her decision within 2 days of receiving her father's letter, packing a small case with practical clothing and the basic medical supplies Louisa insisted she bring, given the seriousness of the situation described. Nathaniel offered to accompany her partway on the journey, citing professional concern about the medical complications described in the letter, though Eleanor suspected his genuine worry for her well-being played an equal part in the offer. "You do not need to feel obligated toward her," Nathaniel said carefully, as their carriage made its way toward the county Eleanor had left behind nearly a year earlier. Whatever happened between you, whatever pain she caused you, you are not required to sacrifice your own peace to help her now. I know that, Eleanor said, staring out at the familiar countryside beginning to appear as they drew closer to home. But I find that despite everything, I do not wish to carry the additional weight of having refused to help my sister during a genuine medical crisis, regardless of how she has behaved toward me in the past. That is not a burden I wish to add to everything else I already carry. Nathaniel nodded, understanding the complicated logic of her reasoning, even if it required navigating difficult emotional terrain that had nothing to do with simple medical necessity. Then I am glad to accompany you as far as I am able, he said, and I will trust your judgment about how much of yourself you are willing to offer once we arrive. The Hartley family home looked exactly as Eleanor remembered it, though something about seeing it again after so many months away made the familiar stone walls feel almost foreign, as though she were viewing a place from a previous chapter of her life, rather than somewhere she still fully belonged. Her mother met her at the door with tears streaming down her face, embracing her tightly, before leading her quickly toward the room where Charlotte had been confined to bed rest for the past several weeks. Charlotte looked pale and exhausted, her once vibrant features drawn tight with worry and physical discomfort. When she saw Eleanor enter the room, her eyes widened with a mixture of surprise and something that looked remarkably like relief. "You came," Charlotte said weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course I came," Eleanor said, moving to her sister's bedside, despite the complicated tangle of emotions still present between them. "Whatever else has happened between us, I could not simply ignore news that you might be in genuine danger." The family physician, an older man Eleanor remembered from her childhood, explained the situation with careful precision. Charlotte's condition had grown increasingly concerning over the past 2 weeks, with symptoms that suggested serious complications that could threaten both her life and that of the child she carried. He had done what he could with his available knowledge and resources, but admitted openly that the situation required more specialized care than he felt fully equipped to provide. Eleanor drew on everything she had learned during her months of training in Ashford, carefully reviewing Charlotte's symptoms and the treatments already attempted, before sending an urgent message to Nathaniel, who had remained at a nearby inn per her earlier request, asking him to come immediately, with whatever additional medical knowledge and supplies he could offer. Over the following days, Eleanor and Nathaniel worked together closely with the family physician, implementing careful adjustments to Charlotte's care that drew on more recent medical understanding than had been previously available in their rural county. The work was exhausting and uncertain, filled with tense hours where the outcome remained genuinely unclear, but slowly, gradually, Charlotte's condition began to stabilize. During the long hours spent at her sister's bedside, tending to her care alongside the medical team, Eleanor found herself confronting the complicated reality of her feelings toward Charlotte in ways she had avoided during her months of distance in Ashford. She watched her sister's fear during the most difficult moments, watched Alexander's genuine anguish as he sat vigil beside his wife's bed, watched her parents struggle with the possibility of losing a daughter, and found that the sharp edges of her anger had softened into something more complicated. Neither full forgiveness nor lingering resentment, but something that acknowledged the full humanity of everyone involved in the painful events of the past year. Late one evening, as Charlotte finally began showing clear signs of genuine improvement, Eleanor sat alone with her sister, while the rest of the household finally allowed themselves to rest after days of anxious vigilance. "I did not expect you to help me this way," Charlotte said quietly, her voice stronger now than it had been in days. "After everything I did to you, I would not have blamed you for staying away. I considered it," Eleanor admitted honestly, "but I could not have lived with myself if I had refused to help while you were genuinely in danger, regardless of the pain you caused me." Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, studying her sister's face carefully. "I have thought a great deal, during these difficult weeks, about the choices I made," she said finally. "I do not think I can ever fully make amends for what I did to you, but I want you to know that I understand now, more clearly than I did before, exactly how much damage my selfishness caused, not just to you, but to our entire family." Eleanor considered her sister's words carefully, weighing them against the genuine growth she had witnessed in Charlotte during these tense days of illness and uncertainty. "I do not think we can simply return to how things were before," she said honestly. "Too much has happened, and some wounds take a very long time to heal fully. if they ever fully heal at all. But I do not wish to carry this anger forever, Charlotte. It has already cost me enough of my peace these past months. What would you need from me? Charlotte asked carefully, to begin building something new between us, even if it can never be exactly what we once had. Eleanor considered this question seriously before answering. Honesty, she said finally. Complete honesty, going forward, about everything, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable it might be to share. And patience, from both of us, to rebuild trust, slowly, without expecting it to return all at once, simply because we wish it to. Charlotte nodded, tears filling her eyes once more, though these seemed to carry a different quality than her earlier tears of physical distress. I can offer that, she said. I want to offer that, truly, if you are willing to give me the chance to prove it over time. The two sisters sat together quietly as the evening deepened around them, neither pretending that the difficult history between them had been fully resolved, but both recognizing, perhaps for the first time since the terrible day of the wedding, that some form of genuine reconciliation might yet be possible, built slowly and carefully from the wreckage of what had come before. Charlotte's recovery continued steadily over the following weeks, and eventually she gave birth to a healthy daughter, whom she and Alexander named Grace, a choice that felt significant to everyone in the family, given the difficult circumstances surrounding the child's arrival into the world. Eleanor stayed through the birth, having grown genuinely invested in her sister's well-being during the intense weeks of medical crisis, and found herself surprised by the tenderness she felt when she first held her infant niece in her arms. She has your eyes, Eleanor said to Charlotte, studying the baby's small features carefully as she sat beside her sister's bed in the days following the birth. Perhaps she will grow up without the complicated history that has shaped our family, Charlotte said softly, watching her daughter sleep peacefully. I hope, at least, that she will grow up understanding that mistakes, even serious ones, do not have to define a person forever, if they are willing to do the difficult work of change. Alexander, who had remained largely quiet during Eleanor's extended stay, approached her one afternoon as she prepared to return to Ashford, now that Charlotte's health had stabilized and the family crisis had largely passed. I owe you a debt I do not know how to properly repay, he said carefully. Your medical knowledge likely saved both Charlotte and Grace during a genuinely dangerous situation. I did not do it for you, Eleanor said honestly, though without the sharp edge her voice might have carried a year earlier. I did it for Charlotte, and for the child who deserved a chance at life regardless of the complicated circumstances of her parents' marriage. Alexander nodded, accepting this distinction without argument. I understand, he said, but I hope you know that my gratitude is genuine nonetheless. And I hope, in time, that some measure of peace might exist between all of us, even if the path to reach it required far more pain than any of us anticipated when this story began. Eleanor considered his words carefully before responding. I think peace is possible, she said finally. Not the peace of forgetting what happened, but the peace of accepting that we are all, in our own ways, still learning how to be better than the mistakes we have made. I do not know if I will ever fully understand why things unfolded as they did, but I find I no longer need that full understanding in order to move forward with my own life. As she prepared to depart for Ashford once more, her parents expressed deep gratitude for her willingness to return during such a difficult crisis, and for the grace she had shown in offering her skills and presence, despite the painful history that might have justified a very different response. Her father, in particular, seemed moved by the maturity and strength Eleanor had demonstrated throughout the ordeal. I am proud of the woman you have become, Edmund said quietly, as he helped load her small case into the waiting carriage. I know this past year has asked more of you than any daughter should have to bear, but you have handled every difficult moment with a grace that speaks well of your character. Thank you, Father, Eleanor said, embracing him warmly before climbing into the carriage. I think, strange as it may sound, that this past year has taught me things about myself I might never have discovered if my life had simply continued along the path I originally expected. The journey back to Ashford felt different than her original departure nearly a year earlier. Where that first journey had carried the heavy weight of fresh heartbreak and uncertain future, this return journey carried something lighter, a sense of genuine resolution, mixed with anticipation, for the life she had begun building for herself in the city, and for the relationship with Nathaniel that had continued deepening, even through the difficult weeks of family crisis. Nathaniel met her carriage upon her arrival back in Ashford, his relief at her safe return evident in the warmth of his greeting. "How is your sister?" he asked, helping her down from the carriage with careful attention. "Recovering well," Eleanor said, "and there is a new niece in the family, healthy and strong, despite the difficult circumstances of her arrival." "And how are you?" Nathaniel asked, studying her face carefully, as though searching for signs of the emotional toll such an extended and difficult visit might have taken. Eleanor considered the question seriously before answering, taking a moment to genuinely assess her own feelings, rather than offering a quick reassurance. "I am well," she said finally, and found that she meant it fully. "Better than I expected to be, given everything that happened during this visit. I think, perhaps, I have finally found a way to make peace with the past year, without needing to erase it entirely, or pretend it did not happen." "That sounds like real healing," Nathaniel said gently, echoing words he had offered her months earlier in the hospital garden. "I believe it is," Eleanor agreed, allowing herself a genuine smile as they walked together back toward Louisa's house, and toward the life she had built for herself in this city, that had become, unexpectedly, her true home. Over the following months, Eleanor completed her formal nursing training and took on increasing responsibility at the hospital, eventually being trusted with the management of an entire ward, under Louisa's watchful but proud supervision. Her relationship with Nathaniel continued to deepen naturally, built not on grand promises made under garden skies, but on the steady accumulation of shared work, mutual respect, and genuine partnership that grew stronger through both the ordinary rhythms of daily life and the occasional difficult challenges that tested their commitment to one another. Letters continued to travel between Eleanor and her family back home, gradually shifting in tone from careful politeness to something warmer and more genuine, particularly between Eleanor and Charlotte, who found themselves, over time, rebuilding a sisterly bond that neither had expected to recover so fully after the devastating events of that terrible wedding day. Charlotte wrote often about young Grace's development, and Eleanor found herself genuinely delighted by each small milestone described in her sister's increasingly warm and open correspondence. The scandal that had once consumed the entire county's attention gradually faded into simply another story among many, replaced in the collective memory of their community by newer gossip and fresher dramas, as such things inevitably tend to happen with the passage of sufficient time. Eleanor's name, once whispered with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity, gradually came to be associated instead with her genuine accomplishments in Ashford, stories of her medical skill and compassionate care, reaching back to her home county through the natural channels of family correspondence and occasional visits. 2 years after the wedding that had never truly happened, Eleanor stood once more in a chapel, though this one felt entirely different from the grand and crowded space where her original heartbreak had unfolded. This chapel was smaller, quieter, filled with people who had come to celebrate something genuine, rather than gathering to witness a carefully orchestrated social event. Nathaniel stood waiting for her at the front of the room, his expression carrying none of the practiced composure that had marked Alexander's bearing on that terrible day so long ago, but instead a simple, open joy that made Eleanor's heart feel full in a way she had once feared she might never experience again. Her family had traveled to Ashford for the occasion, her parents beaming with genuine happiness as they watched their eldest daughter finally find the kind of partnership that honored both her strength and her tenderness. Charlotte sat in the front row, holding young Grace, now a lively toddler who babbled happily throughout the ceremony, occasionally reaching toward her aunt with small outstretched hands. The relationship between the sisters had continued healing steadily over the 2 years since Charlotte's difficult recovery, built now on a foundation of honest communication and mutual respect that neither had thought possible during the darkest days following the broken wedding. Alexander had also made the journey, standing quietly near the back of the chapel, his presence a quiet acknowledgement of how far all of them had traveled from that painful day years earlier. He and Eleanor had reached, over time, a kind of careful peace, not close friendship, but a genuine absence of bitterness that allowed them to exist within the same family gatherings without the tension that had once seemed impossible to overcome. Louisa stood near the front as well, having played such a central role in Eleanor's journey toward this moment, her expression carrying the particular pride of someone who had watched a person she loved discover genuine strength through genuine difficulty. As Eleanor walked down the modest aisle toward Nathaniel, she found herself thinking, not with bitterness but with a kind of grateful clarity, about the 7 years she had once spent waiting faithfully for a promise that ultimately proved hollow. That waiting, painful as its ending had been, had taught her something essential about her own capacity for patience and loyalty. And the year of heartbreak and rebuilding that followed had taught her something equally important about her own strength, her own capacity for genuine healing, and her own ability to build a life defined by her own choices, rather than simply waiting for someone else's promise to be fulfilled. Nathaniel took her hands as she reached the front of the chapel, his eyes warm with genuine love rather than the complicated mixture of obligation and uncertainty that had characterized her previous almost wedding. "You look happy," he said quietly, just for her to hear. "I am happy," Eleanor said, and found the words carried a simple truth that required no further explanation or qualification. "Genuinely, completely happy, in a way I once feared I might never feel again." As the ceremony proceeded, filled with vows built on honest partnership rather than youthful promises made under uncertain circumstances, Eleanor felt a profound sense of gratitude for the difficult journey that had led her to this exact moment. She thought of the frightened, heartbroken woman who had stood behind a curtain years earlier, watching her entire imagined future collapse in a single devastating moment. That woman could not have imagined the genuine happiness waiting for her on the other side of that pain, could not have known that sometimes the ending of one story, however painful, creates space for a far better story to begin. After the ceremony concluded, as guests gathered for a simple but joyful celebration in the garden behind the chapel, Charlotte found a quiet moment to speak privately with her sister. "I am so happy for you," Charlotte said, embracing Eleanor warmly. "You deserve every bit of the happiness you have found here." "Thank you," Eleanor said, returning the embrace with genuine warmth. "And thank you, truly, for the journey we have taken together these past 2 years, rebuilding what once seemed impossible to repair." "I think," Charlotte said thoughtfully, watching young Grace toddle happily across the garden grass nearby, "that perhaps some of the most important lessons in life come from surviving the moments we least expect, the moments that break apart everything we thought we understood about our own futures. You have shown me, through everything that happened, what genuine strength and genuine grace actually look like." Eleanor smiled at her sister, feeling the last remnants of old bitterness finally settle fully into peace. "We have both learned a great deal," she said, "and I think, in the end, we have both found our way toward lives that are genuinely our own, built from choices we made ourselves, rather than promises made by others." As the celebration continued into the warm afternoon, filled with laughter and genuine joy, rather than the careful performance of happiness that had characterized that terrible day years earlier, Eleanor found herself surrounded by the people who mattered most in her life, people who had walked alongside her, through genuine heartbreak, toward genuine healing. She thought of the 7 years she had once spent waiting faithfully for a duke who ultimately chose someone else, and found that she could finally look back on that painful chapter of her life, not with regret, but with a quiet gratitude for everything it had taught her about her own resilience, her own capacity for growth, and her own ability to build a life filled with genuine love, chosen deliberately and built carefully, rather than simply hoped for and waited upon. The sun set gently over the garden as the celebration continued, casting golden light across the faces of everyone gathered there, each of them carrying their own complicated history of pain and healing, but united in this moment by genuine joy for the woman who had waited 7 years for a promise that failed her, only to discover, in the end, a happiness far more genuine and lasting than anything she had originally imagined for herself.